Service-service relationships. Ocellaris clownfish and Ritter's sea anemones live in a mutual service-service symbiosis, the fish driving off butterflyfish and the anemone's tentacles protecting the fish from predators. Strict service-service interactions are very rare, for reasons that are far from clear. 10. One example is the relationship between sea anemones and anemone fish in the family Pomacentridae. The anemones provide the fish with protection from predators, which cannot tolerate the stings of the anemone's tentacles, and the fish defend the anemones against butterflyfish family Chaetodontidae, which eat anemones. However, in common with many mutualisms, there is more than one aspect to it. In the anemone fish anemone mutualism, waste ammonia from the fish feeds the symbiotic algae that are found in the anemone's tentacles. 1920 Therefore, what appears to be a service-service mutualism in fact has a service-resource component. A second example is that of the relationship between some ants in the genus Pseudomyrmex and trees in the genus Acacia, such as the whistling thorn and bullhorn acacia. The ants nest inside the plant's thorns. In exchange for shelter, the ants protect acacias from attack by herbivores, which they frequently eat when those are small enough, introducing a resource component to this service-service relationship, and competition from other plants by trimming back vegetation that would shade the acacia. In addition, another service-resource component is present, as the ants regularly feed on lipid-rich food bodies called Beltian bodies that are on the acacia plant. 21. In the neotropics, the ant Myrmellochysta schumani makes its nest in special cavities in Doroia hirsute. Plants in the vicinity that belong to other species are killed with formic acid. This selective gardening can be so aggressive that small areas of the rainforest are dominated by Doroia hirsute. These peculiar patches are known by local people as devil's gardens. 22. In some of these relationships, the cost of the ant's protection can be quite expensive. Cordia sp. Trees in the Amazonian rainforest have a kind of partnership with Allomorus sp. Ants, which make their nests in modified leaves. To increase the amount of living space available, the ants will destroy the tree's flower buds. The flowers die and leaves develop instead, providing the ants with more dwellings. Another type of Allomorus sp. Ant lives with the Hertella sp. Tree in the same forests, but in this relationship, the tree has turned the tables on the ants. When the tree is ready to produce flowers, the antipodes on certain branches begin to wither and shrink, forcing the occupants to flee, leaving the tree's flowers to develop free from ant attack. 22. The term, species group, can be used to describe the manner in which individual organisms group together. In this non-taxonomic context one can refer to same species groups and mixed species groups. While same species groups are the norm, examples of mixed species groups abound. For example, zebra Equus burchelli and wildebeest Connochetes taurinus can remain in association during periods of long-distance migration across the Serengeti as a strategy for thwarting predators. Cercopithecus mitis and Cercopithecus ascanius, species of monkey in the Kakamega forest of Kenya, can stay in close proximity and travel along exactly the same routes through the forest for periods of up to 12 hours. These mixed species groups cannot be explained by the coincidence of sharing the same habitat. Rather, they are created by the active behavioral choice of at least one of the species in question. 23. Mathematical modeling. Mathematical treatments of mutualisms, like the study of mutualisms in general, have lagged behind those for predation, or predator-prey, consumer-resource interactions. In models of mutualisms, the terms type 1 and type 2 functional responses refer to the linear and saturating relationships, respectively, between the benefit provided to an individual of species 1 dependent variable and the density of species 2 independent variable. Type 1 functional response. One of the simplest frameworks for modeling species interactions is the Lotka-Volterra equations. 24. In this model, the changes in population densities of the two mutualists are quantified as where equals the population density of species I equals the intrinsic growth rate of the population of species I equals the negative effect of within species crowding on species I equals the beneficial effect of the density of species J on species I. Mutualism is in essence the logistic growth equation modified for mutualistic interaction. The mutualistic interaction term represents the increase in population growth of one species as a result of the presence of greater numbers of another species. As the mutualistic interactive term beta is always positive, this simple model may lead to unrealistic unbounded growth. 25. So it may be more realistic to include a further term in the formula, representing a saturation mechanism, to avoid this occurring. Type 2 functional response. In 1989, David Hamilton Wright modified the above Lotka-Volterra equations by adding a new term, beta mk, to represent a mutualistic relationship. 26. Wright also considered the concept of saturation, which means that with higher densities, there is a decrease in the benefits of further increases of the mutualist population. Without saturation, depending on the size of parameter alpha, species densities would increase indefinitely. Because that is not possible due to environmental constraints and carrying capacity, a model that includes saturation would be more accurate. Wright's mathematical theory is based on the premise of a simple two-species mutualism model in which the benefits of mutualism become saturated due to limits posed by handling time. Wright defines handling time as the time needed to process a food item, from the initial interaction to the start of a search for new food items, and assumes that processing of food and searching for food are mutually exclusive. Mutualists that display foraging behavior are exposed to the restrictions on handling time. Mutualism can be associated with symbiosis. Handling time interactions. In 1959, C.S. Halling performed his classic disk experiment that assumed that 1. The number of food items captured is proportional to the allotted searching time, and 2. That there is a handling time variable that exists separately from the notion of search time. He then developed an equation for the type 2 functional response, which showed that the feeding rate is equivalent to where A equals the instantaneous discovery rate, X equals food item density, TH equals handling time. The equation that incorporates type 2 functional response and mutualism is where N and M equals densities of the two mutualists. R equals intrinsic rate of increase of N. C equals coefficient measuring negative intraspecific interaction. This is equivalent to inverse of the carrying capacity, 1K, of N, in the logistic equation. A equals instantaneous discovery rate. B equals coefficient converting encounters with M to new units of N or, equivalently, where X equals 1 at H. Beta equals B TH. This model is most effectively applied to free-living species that encounter a number of individuals of the mutualist part in the course of their existences. Wright notes that models of biological mutualism tend to be similar qualitatively, in that the featured isoclines generally have a positive decreasing slope, and by and large similar isocline diagrams. Mutualistic interactions are best visualized as positively sloped isoclines, which can be explained by the fact that the saturation of benefits accorded to mutualism or restrictions posed by outside factors contribute to a decreasing slope. The type 2 functional response is visualized as the graph of versus M. Structure of networks. Mutualistic networks made up out of the interaction between plants and pollinators were found to have a similar structure in very different ecosystems on different continents, consisting of entirely different species. 27. The structure of these mutualistic networks may have large consequences for the way in which pollinator communities respond to increasingly harsh conditions and on the community carrying capacity. 28. Mathematical models that examine the consequences of this network structure for the stability of pollinator communities suggest that the specific way in which plant-pollinator networks are organized minimizes competition between pollinators. 29. Reduce the spread of indirect effects and thus enhance ecosystem stability. 30. And may even lead to strong indirect facilitation between pollinators when conditions are harsh. 31. This means that pollinator species together can survive under harsh conditions. But it also means that pollinator species collapse simultaneously when conditions pass a critical point. 32. This simultaneous collapse occurs because pollinator species depend on each other when surviving under difficult conditions. 31. Such a community-wide collapse, involving many pollinator species, can occur suddenly when increasingly harsh conditions pass a critical point, and recovery from such a collapse might not be easy. The improvement in conditions needed for pollinators to recover could be substantially larger than the improvement needed to return to conditions at which the pollinator community collapsed. 31. Humans. Dogs and sheep were among the first animals to be domesticated. Humans are involved in mutualisms with other species. Their gut flora is essential for efficient digestion. 33. Infestations of head lice might have been beneficial for humans by fostering an immune response that helps to reduce the threat of body louse-borne lethal diseases. 34. Some relationships between humans and domesticated animals and plants are to different degrees mutualistic. For example, agricultural varieties of maize provide food for humans and are unable to reproduce without human intervention because the leafy sheath does not fall open, and the seed head, the corn on the cob, does not shatter to scatter the seeds naturally. In traditional agriculture, some plants have mutualist as companion plants, providing each other with shelter, soil fertility and/or natural pest control. For example, beans may grow up cornstalks as a trellis, while fixing nitrogen in the soil for the corn, a phenomenon that is used in Three Sisters farming. 35. One researcher has proposed that the key advantage Homo sapiens had over Neanderthals in competing over similar habitats was the former's mutualism with dogs. 36. Intestinal microbiota. The microbiota in the human intestine co-evolved with the human species, and this relationship is considered to be a mutualism that is beneficial both to the human host and the bacteria in the gut population. 37. The mucus layer of the intestine contains commensal bacteria that produce bacteriocins, modify the pH of the intestinal contents, and 37. The mucus layer of the intestine contains commensal bacteria that produce bacteriocins, modify the pH of the intestinal contents, and compete for nutrition to inhibit colonization by pathogens. 38. The gut microbiota, containing trillions of microorganisms, possesses the metabolic capacity to produce and regulate multiple compounds that reach the circulation and act to influence the function of distal organs and systems. 37. The mucus layer of the intestine contains commensal bacteria that produce bacteriocins, modify the pH of the intestinal contents, and compete for nutrition to inhibit colonization by pathogens. 38. The gut microbiota, containing trillions of microorganisms, possesses the metabolic capacity to produce and regulate multiple compounds that reach the circulation and act to influence the function of distal organs and systems. 39. Breakdown of the protective mucosal barrier of the gut can contribute to the development of colon cancer. 38. Evolution of mutualism. Evolution by type. Every generation of every organism needs nutrients, and similar nutrients, more than they need particular defensive characteristics, as the fitness benefit of these vary heavily especially by environment. This may be the reason that hosts are more likely to evolve to become dependent on vertically transmitted bacterial mutualists which provide nutrients than those providing defensive benefits. This pattern is generalized beyond bacteria by Yamada et al. 2015's demonstration that undernourished Drosophila are heavily dependent on their fungal symbiont Isachinkia orientalis for amino acids. 40. Mutualism breakdown. Mutualisms are not static, and can be lost by evolution. 41 Sachs and Sims 2006 suggests that this can occur via four main pathways. 1. One mutualist shifts to parasitism, and no longer benefits its partner, 41 such as head lice 42. 2. One partner abandons the mutualism and lives autonomously, 41. 3. One partner may go extinct, 41. 4. A partner may be switched to another species, 43. There are many examples of mutualism breakdown. For example, plant lineages inhabiting nutrient-rich environments have evolutionarily abandoned mycorrhizal mutualisms many times independently. 44. Evolutionarily, head lice may have been mutualistic as they allow for early immunity to various body louse-borne disease. However, as these diseases became eradicated, the relationship has become less mutualistic and more parasitic. 42. Measuring and defining mutualism. Measuring the exact fitness benefit to the individuals in a mutualistic relationship is not always straightforward, particularly when the individuals can receive benefits from a variety of species, for example most plant pollinator mutualisms. It is therefore common to categorize mutualisms according to the closeness of the association, using terms such as obligate and facultative. Defining closeness, however, is also problematic. It can refer to mutual dependency, the species cannot live without one another, or the biological intimacy of the relationship in relation to physical closeness, e.g., one species living within the tissues of the other species. Measuring the exact fitness benefit to the individuals in a mutualistic relationship is not always straightforward, particularly when the individuals can receive benefits from a variety of species, for example most plant pollinator mutualisms. It is therefore common to categorize mutualisms according to the closeness of the association, using terms such as obligate and facultative. Measuring the exact fitness benefit to the individuals in a mutualistic relationship is not always straightforward, particularly when the individuals can receive benefits from a variety of species, for example most plant pollinator mutualisms. It is therefore common to categorize mutualisms according to the closeness of the association, using terms such as obligate and facultative. Defining closeness, however, is also problematic. It can refer to mutual dependency, the species cannot live without one another, or the biological intimacy of the relationship in relation to physical closeness, e.g., one species living within the tissues of the other species. 10. Symbiosis. Symbiosis, ancient Greek symbiosis, living with, companionship less than sin, together, and biosis, living to, is any type of a close and long-term biological interaction between two organisms of different species. The two organisms, termed symbionts, can be either in a mutualistic, a commensalistic, or a parasitic relationship. 3. In 1879, Heinrich Anton de Berry defined symbiosis as the living together of unlike organisms. In a cleaning symbiosis, the clownfish feeds on small invertebrates that otherwise have potential to harm the sea anemone, and the fecal matter from the clownfish provides nutrients to the sea anemone. The clownfish is protected from predators by the anemone's stinging cells, to which the clownfish is immune. The relationship is therefore classified as mutualistic. 1. The term is sometimes more exclusively used in a restricted, mutualistic sense, where both symbionts contribute to each other's subsistence. 3. Symbiosis can be obligatory, which means that one, or both of the symbionts depend on each other for survival, or facultative optional when they can also subsist independently. Symbiosis is also classified by physical attachment. Symbionts forming a single body live in conjunctive symbiosis, while all other arrangements are called disjunctive symbiosis. 4. When one organism lives on the surface of another, such as head lice on humans, it is called ectosymbiosis. When one partner lives inside the tissues of another, such as symbiodinium within coral, it is termed endosymbiosis. 5. 6. Definition. Diagram of the 6 possible types of symbiotic relationship, from mutual benefit to mutual harm. The definition of symbiosis was a matter of debate for 130 years. 7. In 1877, Albert Bernhard Frank used the term symbiosis to describe the mutualistic relationship in lichens. 8. 9. In 1878, the German mycologist Heinrich Anton de Berry defined it as the living together of unlike organisms. 10. 11. 12. The definition has varied among scientists, with some advocating that it should only refer to persistent mutualisms, while others thought it should apply to all persistent biological interactions, in other words, to mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism, but excluding brief interactions such as predation. In the 21st century, the latter has become the definition widely accepted by biologists. 13. In 1949, Edward Haskell proposed an integrative approach with a classification of co-actions, 14, later adopted by biologists as interactions. 15, 16, 17, 18. Types. Obligate versus facultative. Relationships can be obligate, meaning that one or both of the symbionts entirely depend on each other for survival. For example, in lichens, which consist of fungal and photosynthetic symbionts, the fungal partners cannot live on their own. 11, 19, 20, 21. The algal or cyanobacterial symbionts in lichens, such as Trentepolia, can generally live independently, and their part of the relationship is therefore described as facultative, optional, or non-obligate. 22. When one of the participants in a symbiotic relationship is capable of photosynthesis, as with lichens, it is called photosymbiosis. 23, 24. Ectosymbiosis versus endosymbiosis. Alder tree root nodule houses endosymbiotic nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Ectosymbiosis is any symbiotic relationship in which a symbiont lives on the body surface of the host, including the inner surface of the digestive tract or the ducts of exocrine glands. 625 Examples of this include ectoparasites such as lice, commensal ectosymbionts such as the barnacles, which attach themselves to the jaw of baleen whales, and mutualist ectosymbionts such as cleaner fish. Contrastingly, endosymbiosis is any symbiotic relationship in which one symbiont lives within the tissues of the other, either within the cells or extracellularly. 626 Examples include diverse microbiomes, rhizobia, nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live in root nodules on legume roots, actinomycetes, nitrogen-fixing bacteria such as Frankia, which live in alder root nodules, single-celled algae inside reef-building corals, and bacterial endosymbionts that provide essential nutrients to about 10%–15% of insects. 27. In endosymbiosis, the host cell lacks some of the nutrients which the endosymbiont provides. As a result, the host favors endosymbiont growth processes within itself by producing some specialized cells. These cells affect the genetic composition of the host in order to regulate the increasing population of the endosymbionts and ensure that these genetic changes are passed on to the offspring via vertical transmission heredity. 28. As the endosymbiont adapts to the host's lifestyle, the endosymbiont changes dramatically. There is a drastic reduction in its genome size, as many genes are lost during the process of metabolism, and DNA repair and recombination, while important genes participating in the DNA to RNA transcription, protein translation and DNA-RNA replication are retained. The decrease in genome size is due to loss of protein-coding genes and not due to lessening of intergenic regions or open reading frame or size. Species that are naturally evolving and contain reduced sizes of genes can be accounted for an increased number of noticeable differences between them, thereby leading to changes in their evolutionary rates. When endosymbiotic bacteria related with insects are passed on to the offspring strictly via vertical genetic transmission, intracellular bacteria go across many hurdles during the process, resulting in a decrease in effective population sizes, as compared to the free-living bacteria. The incapability of the endosymbiotic bacteria to reinstate their wild-type phenotype via a recombination process is called Muller's ratchet phenomenon. Muller's ratchet phenomenon, together with less effective population sizes, leads to an accretion of deleterious mutations in the non-essential genes of the intracellular bacteria. 29. This can be due to lack of selection mechanisms prevailing in the relatively rich host environment. 30-31. Competition. Competition can be defined. These cells affect the genetic composition of the host in order to regulate the increasing population of the endosymbionts and ensure that these genetic changes. Contrastingly, endosymbiosis is any symbiotic relationship in which one symbiont lives within the tissues of the other, either within the cells or extracellularly. 626 Examples include diverse microbiomes, rhizobia, nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live in root nodules on legume roots, actinomycetes, nitrogen-fixing bacteria such as Frankia, which live in alder root nodules, single-celled algae inside reef-building corals, and bacterial endosymbionts that provide essential nutrients to about 10%–15% of insects. Contrastingly, endosymbiosis is any symbiotic relationship in which one symbiont lives within the tissues of the other, either within the cells or extracellularly. 626 Examples include diverse microbiomes, rhizobia, nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live in root nodules on legume roots, actinomycetes, nitrogen-fixing bacteria such as Frankia, which live in alder root nodules, single-celled algae inside reef-building corals, and bacterial endosymbionts that provide essential nutrients to about 10%–15% of insects. 27. In endosymbiosis, the host cell lacks some of the nutrients which the endosymbiont provides. As a result, the host favors endosymbionts growth processes within itself by producing some specialized cells. These cells affect the genetic composition of the host in order to regulate the increasing population of the endosymbionts and ensure that these genetic changes are passed on to the offspring via vertical transmission heredity. 28. As the endosymbiont adapts to the host's lifestyle, the endosymbiont changes dramatically. There is a drastic reduction in its genome size, as many genes are lost during the process of metabolism, and DNA repair and recombination, while important genes participating in the DNA to RNA transcription, protein translation and DNA-RNA replication are retained. The decrease in genome size is due to loss of protein-coding genes and not due to lessening of intergenic regions or open reading frame or size. Species that are naturally evolving and contain reduced sizes of genes can be accounted for an increased number of noticeable differences between them, thereby leading to changes in their evolutionary rates. When endosymbiotic bacteria related with insects are passed on to the offspring strictly via vertical genetic transmission, intracellular bacteria go across many hurdles during the process, resulting in a decrease in effective population sizes, as compared to the free-living bacteria. The incapability of the endosymbiotic bacteria to reinstate their wild-type phenotype via a recombination process is called Muller's ratchet phenomenon. Muller's ratchet phenomenon, together with less effective population sizes, leads to an accretion of deleterious mutations in the non-essential genes of the intracellular bacteria. 30-31. 29. This can be due to lack of selection. When endosymbiotic bacteria related with insects are passed on to the offspring strictly via vertical genetic transmission, intracellular bacteria go across many hurdles during the process, resulting in a decrease in effective population sizes, as compared to the free-living bacteria. The incapability of the endosymbiotic bacteria to reinstate their wild-type phenotype via a recombination process is called Muller's ratchet phenomenon. Muller's ratchet phenomenon, together with less effective population sizes, leads to an accretion of deleterious mutations in the non-essential genes of the intracellular bacteria. 29. This can be due to lack of selection mechanisms prevailing in the relatively rich host environment. 30-31. Competition. Competition can be defined as an interaction between organisms or species, in which the fitness of one is lowered by the presence of another. 32. Limited supply of at least one resource, such as food, water, and territory, used by both usually facilitates this type of interaction, although the competition can also be for other resources. 33. Amensalism. The black walnut secretes a chemical from its roots that harms neighboring plants, an example of antagonism. Amensalism is a non-symbiotic, asymmetric interaction where one species is harmed or killed by the other, and one is unaffected by the other. 34-35. There are two types of amensalism, competition and antagonism, or antibiosis. Competition is where a larger or stronger organism deprives a smaller or weaker one of a resource. Antagonism occurs when one organism is damaged or killed by another through a chemical secretion. An example of competition is a sapling growing under the shadow of a mature tree. The mature tree can rob the sapling of necessary sunlight and, if the mature tree is very large, it can take up rainwater and deplete soil nutrients. Throughout the process, the mature tree is unaffected by the sapling. Indeed, if the sapling dies, the mature tree gains nutrients from the decaying sapling. An example of antagonism is Juglans nigra, black walnut, secreting juglone, a substance which destroys many herbaceous plants within its root zone. 36. The term amensalism is often used to describe strongly asymmetrical competitive interactions, such as between the Spanish ibex and weevils of the genus Timarcha, which feed upon the same type of shrub. Whilst the presence of the weevil has almost no influence on food availability, the presence of ibex has an enormous detrimental effect on weevil numbers, as they consume significant quantities of plant matter and incidentally ingest the weevils upon it. 37. Commensal mites. Traveling foracy, on a fly, Pseudolintia. Canariensis. Commensalism describes a relationship between two living organisms where one benefits and the other is not significantly harmed or helped. It is derived from the English word commensal, used of human social interaction. It derives from a medieval Latin word meaning sharing food, formed from com, with, and mensa, table. 38-39. Commensal relationships may involve one organism using another for transportation foracy, or for housing inquilinism, or it may also involve one organism using something another created, after its death metabiosis. Examples of metabiosis are hermit crabs using gastropod shells to protect their bodies, and spiders building their webs on plants. Mutualism. Hermit crab, Calcinus leviminus, with sea anemone. Mutualism or interspecies reciprocal altruism is a long-term relationship between individuals of different species where both individuals benefit. 38. Mutualistic relationships may be either obligate for both species, obligate for one but facultative for the other, or facultative for both. Bryoliths document a mutualistic symbiosis between a hermit crab and encrusting bryozoans. Many herbivores have mutualistic gut flora to help them digest plant matter, which is more difficult to digest than animal prey. 5. This gut flora comprises cellulose-digesting protozoans or bacteria living in the herbivore's intestines. 40. Coral reefs result from mutualism between coral organisms and various algae living inside them. 41. Most land plants and land ecosystems rely on mutualism between the plants, which fix carbon from the air, and mycorrhizal fungi, which help in extracting water and minerals from the ground. 42. An example of mutualism is the relationship between the Ocellaris clownfish that dwell among the tentacles of Rittery sea anemones. The territorial fish protects the anemone from anemone-eating fish, and in turn, the anemone stinging tentacles protect the clownfish from its predators. A special mucus on the clownfish protects it from the stinging tentacles. 43. A further example is the goby, a fish which sometimes lives together with a shrimp. The shrimp digs and cleans up a burrow in the sand in which both the shrimp and the goby fish live. The shrimp is almost blind, leaving it vulnerable to predators when outside its burrow. In case of danger, the goby touches the shrimp with its tail to warn it, and both quickly retreat into the burrow. 44. Different species of gobies, Elecatinus spp. Also clean up ectoparasites in other fish, possibly another kind of mutualism. 45. A spectacular example of obligate mutualism is the relationship between the cibiglinid tube worms and symbiotic bacteria that live at hydrothermal vents and cold seats. The worm has no digestive tract and is wholly reliant on its internal symbionts for nutrition. The bacteria oxidize either hydrogen sulfide or methane, which the host supplies to them. These worms were discovered in the late 1980s at the hydrothermal vents near the Galapagos Islands and have since been found at deep-sea hydrothermal vents and cold seats in all of the world's oceans. 46. Mutualism improves both organisms' competitive ability and will outcompete organisms of the same species that lack the symbiont. 47. A facultative symbiosis is seen in encrusting bryozoans and hermit crabs. The bryozoan colony, Acanthodesia commensale, develops a serum rotatory growth and offers the crab, Pseudopagirus granuliminus, a helicospiral tubular extension of its living chamber that initially was situated within a gastropod shell. 48. Parasitism. Head, Scolex, of tapeworm Taenia solium is adapted to parasitism with hooks and suckers to attach to its host. In a parasitic relationship, the parasite benefits while the host is harmed. 49. Parasitism takes many forms, from endoparasites that live within the host's body to ectoparasites and parasitic castrators that live on its surface and micropredators like mosquitoes that visit intermittently. Parasitism is an extremely successful mode of life. Parasitism is an extremely successful mode of life. About 40% of all animal species are parasites, and the average mammal species is host to 4 nematodes, 2 cestodes, and 2 trematodes. 50. Mimicry. Mimicry is a form of symbiosis in which a species adopts distinct characteristics of another species to alter its relationship dynamic with the species being mimicked, to its own advantage. Among the many types of mimicry are Batesian and Müllerian, the first involving one-sided exploitation, the second providing mutual benefit. Batesian mimicry is an exploitative three-party interaction where one species, the mimic, has evolved to mimic another, the model, to deceive a third, the dupe. In terms of signaling theory, the mimic and model have evolved to send a signal, the dupe has evolved to receive it from the model. This is to the advantage of the mimic but to the detriment of both the model, whose protective signals are effectively weakened, and of the dupe, which is deprived of an edible prey. For example, a wasp is a strongly defended model, which signals with its conspicuous black and yellow coloration that it is an unprofitable prey to predators such as birds which hunt by sight. Many hoverflies are Batesian mimics of wasps, and any bird that avoids these hoverflies is a dupe. 51-52. In contrast, Müllerian mimicry is mutually beneficial as all participants are both models and mimics. 53-54. For example, different species of bumblebee mimic each other, with similar warning coloration and combinations of black, white, red, and yellow, and all of them benefit from the relationship. 55. Cleaning symbiosis. Cleaning symbiosis is an association between individuals of two species, where one, the cleaner, removes and eats parasites and other materials from the surface of the other, the client. 56. It is putatively mutually beneficial, but biologists have long debated whether it is mutual selfishness, or simply exploitative. Cleaning symbiosis is well known among marine fish, where some small species of cleaner fish, notably wrasses, but also species in other genera, are specialized to feed almost exclusively by cleaning larger fish and other marine animals. 57. In a supreme situation, the host species, fish or marine life, will display itself at a designated station deemed the cleaning station. 58. Cleaner fish play an essential role in the reduction of parasitism on marine animals. Some shark species participate in cleaning symbiosis, where cleaner fish remove ectoparasites from the body of the shark. 59. A study by Raymond Keyes addresses the atypical behavior of a few shark species when exposed to cleaner fish. In this experiment, cleaner wrasse, labroids domitiatus, and various shark species were placed in a tank together and observed. The different shark species exhibited different responses and behaviors around the wrasse. For example, Atlantic and Pacific lemon sharks consistently react to the wrasse fish in a fascinating way. During the interaction, the shark remains passive and the wrasse swims to it. It begins to scan the shark's body, sometimes stopping to inspect specific areas. Commonly, the wrasse would inspect the gills, labial regions, and skin. When the wrasse makes its way to the mouth of the shark often ceases breathing for up to 2.5 minutes so that the fish is able to scan the mouth. Then, the fish passes further into the mouth to examine the gills, specifically the buccopharyngeal area, which typically holds the most parasites. When the shark begins to close its mouth, the wrasse finishes its examination and goes elsewhere. Male bull sharks exhibit slightly different behavior at cleaning stations. As the shark swims into a colony of wrasse fish, it drastically slows its speed to allow the cleaners to do their job. After approximately 1 minute, the shark returns to normal swimming speed. 59. Role in evolution. Leafhoppers protected by meat ants. Symbiosis is increasingly recognized as an important selective force behind evolution. 60. Many species have a long history of interdependent co-evolution. 61. Although symbiosis was once discounted as an anecdotal evolutionary phenomenon, evidence is now overwhelming that obligate or facultative associations among microorganisms and between microorganisms and multicellular hosts had crucial consequences in many landmark events in evolution and in the generation of phenotypic diversity and complex phenotypes able to colonize new environments. 62. Hologenome development and evolution. Evolution originated from changes in development where variations within species are selected for or against because of the symbionts involved. 63. The hologenome theory relates to the holobiont and symbiont's genome together as a whole. 64. Microbes live everywhere in and on every multicellular organism. 65. Many organisms rely on their symbionts in order to develop properly. This is known as co-development. In cases of co-development, the symbionts send signals to their host which determine developmental processes. Co-development is commonly seen in both arthropods and vertebrates. 63. Symbiogenesis. One hypothesis for the origin of the nucleus in eukaryotes, plants, animals, fungi, and protists is that it developed from a symbiogenesis between bacteria and archaea. 66-67. It is hypothesized that the symbiosis originated when ancient archaea, similar to modern methanogenic archaea, invaded and lived within bacteria similar to modern myxobacteria, eventually forming the early nucleus. This theory is analogous to the accepted theory for the origin of eukaryotic mitochondria and chloroplasts, which are thought to have developed from a similar endosymbiotic relationship between protoeukaryotes and aerobic bacteria. 68. Evidence for this includes the fact that mitochondria and chloroplasts divide independently of the cell, and that these organelles have their own genome. 69. The biologist Lynn Margulis, famous for her work on endosymbiosis, contended that symbiosis is a major driving force behind evolution. She considered Darwin's notion of evolution, driven by competition, to be incomplete and claimed that evolution is strongly based on cooperation, interaction, and mutual dependence among organisms. According to Margulis and her son Dorian Sagan, life did not take over the globe by combat, but by networking. 70. Major examples of co-evolutionary relationships. Mycorrhiza. About 80% of vascular plants worldwide form symbiotic relationships with fungi, in particular in arbuscular mycorrhizas. 71. Pollination is a mutualism between flowering plants and their animal pollinators. Pollination. A fig is pollinated by the fig wasp, Blastophaga psns. Flowering plants and the animals that pollinate them have co-evolved. Many plants that are pollinated by insects in entomophilic bats, or birds in ornithophily, have highly specialized flowers modified to promote pollination by a specific pollinator that is correspondingly adapted. The first flowering plants in the fossil record had relatively simple flowers. Adaptive speciation quickly gave rise to many diverse groups of plants, and, at the same time, corresponding speciation occurred in certain insect groups. Some groups of plants developed nectar and large sticky pollen, while insects evolved more specialized morphologies to access and collect these rich food sources. In some taxa of plants and insects, the relationship has become dependent. 72, where the plant species can only be pollinated by one species of insect. 73. Pseudomyrmex ant on Bullthorn Facelia cornigera, with Beltian bodies that provide the ants with protein. 74. Acacia ants and acacias. The acacia ant, Pseudomyrmex ferruginea, is an obligate plant ant that protects at least 5 species of Acacia, Facelia, from preying insects and from other plants competing for sunlight, and the tree provides nourishment and shelter for the ant and its larvae. 74, 75. Seed dispersal. Seed dispersal is the movement, spread or transport of seeds away from the parent plant. Plants have limited mobility and rely upon a variety of dispersal vectors to transport their propagules, including both abiotic vectors such as the wind and living biotic vectors like birds. In order to attract animals, these plants evolved a set of morphological characters such as fruit color, mass, and persistence correlated to particular seed dispersal agents. 76. For example, plants may evolve conspicuous fruit colors to attract avian frugivores, and birds may learn to associate such colors with a food resource. 77. Rhizobia lichens. Commensalism. Commensalism is a long-term biological interaction, symbiosis, in which members of one species gain benefits while those of the other species neither benefit nor are harmed. 1. This is in contrast with mutualism, in which both organisms benefit from each other, amensalism, where one is harmed while the other is unaffected, and parasitism, where one is harmed and the other benefits. Remora are specially adapted to attach themselves to larger fish or other animals, in this case a sea turtle, that provide locomotion and food. The commensal, the species that benefits from the association, may obtain nutrients, shelter, support, or locomotion from the host species, which is substantially unaffected. The commensal relation is often between a larger host and a smaller commensal. The host organism is unmodified, whereas the commensal species may show great structural adaptation consistent with its habits, as in the remoras that ride attached to sharks and other fishes. Remoras feed on their host's fecal matter. 2. While pilotfish feed on the leftovers of their host's meals. Numerous birds perch on bodies of large mammal herbivores or feed on the insects turned up by grazing mammals. 3. Etymology. The word, commensalism, is derived from the word, commensal, meaning, eating at the same table, in human social interaction, which in turn comes through French from the medieval Latin commensalis, meaning, sharing a table, from the prefix com, meaning, together, and mensa, meaning, table, or, meal. 4. Commensality, at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, refers to professors eating at the same table as students, as they live in the same college. Pierre-Joseph van Benden introduced the term, commensalism, in 1876. 5. Examples of commensal relationships. Examples of commensal relationships. Domestic and feral pigeons, Columba livia domestica, are commensals, having lived alongside humans for thousands of years after being domesticated from the rock dove Columba livia. Due to its range being expanded with human assistance, the pigeon has a cosmopolitan distribution. 6. The commensal pathway was traversed by animals that fed on refuse around human habitats or by animals that preyed on other animals drawn to human camps. Those animals established a commensal relationship with humans in which the animals benefited but the humans received little benefit or harm. Those animals that were most capable of taking advantage of the resources associated with human camps would have been the tamer individuals, less aggressive, with shorter fight or flight distances. Later, these animals developed closer social or economic bonds with humans and led to a domestic relationship. 7, 8. The leap from a synanthropic population to a domestic one could only have taken place after the animals had progressed from anthropophily to habituation to commensalism and partnership, at which point the establishment of a reciprocal relationship between animal and human would have laid the foundation for domestication, including captivity and then human-controlled breeding. From this perspective, animal domestication is a coevolutionary process in which a population responds to selective pressure while adapting to a novel niche that includes another species with evolving behaviors. 8. Dogs. The dog was the first domesticated animal, and was domesticated and widely established across Eurasia before the end of the Pleistocene, well before the cultivation of crops or the domestication of other animals. 9. The dog is often hypothesized to be a classic example of a domestic animal that likely traveled a commensal pathway into domestication. Archaeological evidence, such as the Bonn Oberkassel dog dating to approximately 14,000 BP, 10 supports the hypothesis that dog domestication preceded the emergence of agriculture 11, 12, and began close to the last glacial maximum when hunter-gatherers preyed on megafauna. The wolves more likely drawn to human camps were the less aggressive, subdominant pack members with lowered flight response, higher stress thresholds, and less wary around humans, and therefore better candidates for domestication. 7. Proto-dogs might have taken advantage of carcasses left on site by early hunters, assisted in the capture of prey, or provided defense from large competing predators it kills. 12. However, the extent to which proto-domestic wolves could have become dependent on this way of life prior to domestication and without human provisioning is unclear and highly debated. In contrast, cats may have become fully dependent on a commensal lifestyle before being domesticated by preying on other commensal animals, such as rats and mice, without any human provisioning. Debate over the extent to which some wolves were commensal with humans prior to domestication stems from debate over the level of human intentionality in the domestication process, which remains untested. 8.13. The earliest sign of domestication in dogs was the neotenization of skull morphology 14.15.7 and the shortening of snout length that results in tooth crowding, reduction in tooth size, and a reduction in the number of teeth 16.7 which has been attributed to the strong selection for reduced aggression. 15.7 This process may have begun during the initial commensal stage of dog domestication, even before humans began to be active partners in the process. 7.8 A mitochondrial, microsatellite, and Y chromosome assessment of two wolf populations in North America combined with satellite telemetry data revealed significant genetic and morphological differences between one population that migrated with and preyed upon caribou and another territorial ecotype population that remained in a boreal coniferous forest. Although these two populations spend a period of the year in the same place, and though there was evidence of gene flow between them, the difference in prey habitat specialization has been sufficient to maintain genetic and even coloration divergence. 17.8 A different study has identified the remains of a population of extinct Pleistocene Beringian wolves with unique mitochondrial signatures. The skull shape, tooth wear, and isotopic signatures suggested these remains were derived from a population of specialist megafauna hunters and scavengers that became extinct while less specialized wolf ecotypes survived. 18.8 Analogous to the modern wolf ecotype that has evolved to track and prey upon caribou, a Pleistocene wolf population could have begun following mobile hunter-gatherers, thus slowly acquiring genetic and phenotypic differences that would have allowed them to more successfully adapt to the human habitat. 19.8 Aspergillus and Staphylococcus. Numerous genera of bacteria and fungi live on and in the human body as part of its natural flora. The fungal genus Aspergillus is capable of living under considerable environmental stress, and thus is capable of colonizing the upper gastrointestinal tract where relatively few examples of the body's gut flora can survive due to highly acidic or alkaline conditions produced by gastric acid and digestive juices. While Aspergillus normally produces no symptoms, in individuals who are immunocompromised or suffering from existing conditions such as tuberculosis, a condition called aspergillosis can occur, in which populations of Aspergillus grow out of control. Staphylococcus aureus, a common bacterial species, is known best for its numerous pathogenic strains that can cause numerous illnesses and conditions. However, many strains of S. aureus are metabiotic commensals, and are present on roughly 20 to 30% of the human population as part of the skin flora. 20. S. aureus also benefits from the variable ambient conditions created by the body's mucous membranes, and as such can be found in the oral and nasal cavities, as well as inside the ear canal. Other Staphylococcus species including S. warneri, S. lugdunensis and S. epidermidis, will also engage in commensalism for similar purposes. Nitrosomonas spp and Nitrobacter spp. Commensalistic relationships between microorganisms include situations in which the waste product of one microorganism is a substrate for another species. One good example is nitrification, the oxidation of ammonium ion to nitrate. Nitrification occurs in two steps. First, bacteria such as Nitrosomonas spp and certain Crenarchaeotes oxidize ammonium to nitrite, and second, nitrite is oxidized to nitrate by Nitrobacter spp. And similar bacteria, Nitrobacter spp, benefit from their association with Nitrosomonas spp, because they use nitrite to obtain energy for growth. Commensalistic associations also occur when one microbial group modifies the environment to make it better suited for another organism. The synthesis of acidic waste products during fermentation stimulates the proliferation of more acid-tolerant microorganisms, which may be only a minor part of the microbial community at neutral pH. A good example is the succession of microorganisms during milk spoilage. Biofilm formation provides another example. The colonization of a newly exposed surface by one type of microorganism, an initial colonizer, makes it possible for other microorganisms to attach to the microbially modified surface. Octocorals and brittle stars. In deep-sea, benthic environments there is an associative relationship between octocorals and brittle stars. Due to the currents flowing upward along seamount ridges, atop these ridges there are colonies of suspension-feeding corals and sponges, and brittle stars that grip tight to them and get up off the seafloor. A specific documented commensal relationship is between the Ophiuron Ophiocreas Oedipus limen and the octocoral primnoid Metallogorgia melanotrichos. Historically, commensalism has been recognized as the usual type of association between brittle stars and octocorals. 21. In this association, the Ophiurons benefit directly by being elevated through facilitating their feeding by suspension, while the octocorals do not seem to benefit or be harmed by this relationship. 22. Recent studies in the Gulf of Mexico have suggested that there are actually some benefits to the octocorals, such as receiving a cleaning action by the brittle star as it slowly moves around the coral. 23. In some cases, a close relationship occurs between cohabiting species, with the interaction beginning from their juvenile stages. 24. Arguments. Whether the relationship between humans and some types of gut flora is commensal or mutualistic is still unanswered. Some biologists argue that any close interaction between two organisms is unlikely to be completely neutral for either party, and that relationships identified as commensal are likely mutualistic or parasitic in a subtle way that has not been detected. For example, epiphytes are nutritional pirates that may intercept substantial amounts of nutrients that would otherwise go to the host plant. 25 large numbers of epiphytes can also cause tree limbs to break or shade the host plant and reduce its rate of photosynthesis. Similarly, phoretic mites may hinder their host by making flight more difficult, which may affect its aerial hunting ability or cause it to expend extra energy while carrying these passengers. Types. Phoretic mites on a flight, Pseudolintia canariensis. Like all ecological interactions, commensalisms vary in strength and duration from intimate, long-lived symbiosis to brief, weak interactions through intermediaries. Phoracy. Phoracy is one animal attached to another exclusively for transport, mainly arthropods, examples of which are mites on insects, such as beetles, flies or bees, pseudoscorpions on mammals, 26, or beetles, and millipedes on birds. 27. Phoracy can be either obligate or facultative, induced by environmental conditions. Inquilinism. Inquilinism, Tillandsia bourgeae growing on an oak tree in Mexico. Inquilinism is the use of a second organism for permanent housing. Examples are epiphytic plants, such as many orchids, that grow on trees, 28, or birds that live in holes in trees. Metabiosis. Metabiosis is a more indirect dependency, in which one organism creates or prepares a suitable environment for a second. Examples include maggots, which develop on and infest corpses, and hermit crabs, which use gastropod shells to protect their bodies. Facilitation. Facilitation or probiosis describes species interactions that benefit at least one of the participants and cause harm to neither. Necromany. Necromany is one animal associating with another until the latter dies, then the former feeds on the corpse of the latter. Examples include some nematodes, 29, and some mites. 30. Competition, biology. Competition is an interaction between organisms or species in which both require one or more resources that are in limited supply, such as food, water, or territory. 1. Competition lowers the fitness of both organisms involved since the presence of one of the organisms always reduces the amount of the resource available to the other. 2. Great egret and neotropic cormorant competing over territory. In the study of community ecology, competition within and between members of a species is an important biological interaction. Competition is one of many interacting biotic and abiotic factors that affect community structure, species diversity, and population dynamics, shifts in a population over time. 3. There are three major mechanisms of competition: interference, exploitation, and apparent competition, in order from most direct to least direct. Interference and exploitation competition can be classed as real forms of competition, while apparent competition is not, as organisms. Competition is one of many interacting biotic and abiotic factors that affect community structure, species diversity, and population dynamics, shifts in a population over time. 3. There are three major mechanisms of competition: interference, exploitation, and apparent competition, in order from most direct to least direct. Interference and exploitation competition can be classed as real forms of competition, while apparent competition is not, as organisms do not share a resource, but instead share a predator. 3. Competition among members of the same species is known as interspecific competition, while competition between individuals of different species is known as interspecific competition. According to the competitive exclusion principle, species less suited to compete for resources must either adapt or die out, although competitive exclusion is rarely found in natural ecosystems. 3. According to evolutionary theory, competition within and between species for resources is important in natural selection. More recently, however, researchers have suggested that evolutionary biodiversity for vertebrates has been driven not by competition between organisms, but by these animals adapting to colonize empty livable space. This is termed the room to roam hypothesis. 4. Interference competition. 4. Interference competition. More recently, however, researchers have suggested that evolutionary biodiversity for vertebrates has been driven not by competition between organisms, but by these animals adapting to colonize empty livable space. This is termed the room to roam hypothesis. 4. Interference competition. Male-male competition in red deer during rut is an example of interference competition within a species. During interference competition, also called contest competition, organisms interact directly by fighting for scarce resources. For example, large aphids defend feeding sites on cottonwood leaves by ejecting smaller aphids from better sites. Male-male competition in red deer during rut is an example of interference competition that occurs within a species. Interference competition occurs directly between individuals via aggression when the individuals interfere with the foraging, survival, and reproduction of others, or by directly preventing their physical establishment in a portion of the habitat. An example of this can be seen between the ant Novomessor cockerelli and red harvester ants, where the former interferes with the ability of the latter to forage by plugging the entrances to their colonies with small rocks. 5. Male bowerbirds, who create elaborate structures called bowers to attract potential mates, may reduce the fitness of their neighbors directly by stealing decorations from their structures. 6. In animals, interference competition is a strategy mainly adopted by larger and stronger organisms within a habitat. As such, populations with high interference competition have adult-driven generation cycles. 7. At first, the growth of juveniles is stunted by larger adult competitors. However, once the juveniles reach adulthood, they experience a secondary growth cycle. 7. Plants, on the other hand, primarily engage in interference competition with their neighbors through allelopathy, or the production of biochemicals. 8. Interference competition can be seen as a strategy that has a clear cost, injury or death, and benefit, obtaining resources that would have gone to other organisms. 9. In order to cope with strong interference competition, other organisms often either do the same or engage in exploitation competition. For example, depending on the season, larger ungulate red deer males are competitively dominant due to interference competition. However, does and fawns have dealt with this through temporal resource partitioning, foraging for food only when adult males are not present. 10. Exploitation competition. Exploitation competition, or scramble competition, occurs indirectly when organisms both use a common limiting resource or shared food item. Instead of fighting or exhibiting aggressive behavior in order to win resources, exploitative competition occurs when resource used by one organism depletes the total amount available for other organisms. These organisms might never interact directly but compete by responding to changes in resource levels. Very obvious examples of this phenomenon include a diurnal species and a nocturnal species that nevertheless share the same resources, or a plant that competes with neighboring plants for light, nutrients, and space for root growth. 11.8. This form of competition typically rewards those organisms who claim the resource first. As such, exploitation competition is often size dependent and smaller organisms are favored since smaller organisms typically have higher foraging rates. 7. Since smaller organisms have an advantage when exploitative competition is important in an ecosystem, this mechanism of competition might lead to a juvenile-driven generation cycle. Individual juveniles succeed and grow fast, but once they mature they are outcompeted by smaller organisms. 7. In plants, exploitative competition can occur both above and below ground. Above ground, plants reduce the fitness of their neighbors by vying for sunlight. Plants consume nitrogen by absorbing it into their roots, making nitrogen unavailable to nearby plants. Plants that produce many roots typically reduce soil nitrogen to very low levels, eventually killing neighboring plants. Exploitative competition has also been shown to occur both within species intraspecific and between different species interspecific. Furthermore, many competitive interactions between organisms are some combination of exploitative and interference competition, meaning the two mechanisms are far from mutually exclusive. For example, a recent 2019 study found that the native thrip species Franklinella intensa was competitively dominant over an invasive thrip species Franklinella occidentalis because it not only exhibited greater time feeding, exploitative competition, but also greater time guarding its resources, interference competition. 12. Plants may also exhibit both forms of competition, not only scrambling for space for root growth but also directly inhibiting other plants' development through allelopathy. Apparent competition. Apparent competition occurs when two otherwise unrelated prey species indirectly compete for survival through a shared predator. 13. This form of competition typically manifests in new equilibrium abundances of each prey species. For example, suppose there are two species, species A and species B, which are preyed upon by food-limited predator species C. Scientists observe an increase in the abundance of species A and a decline in the abundance of species B in an apparent competition model. This relationship is found to be mediated through predator C. A population explosion of species A increases the abundance of predator species C due to a greater total food source. Since there are now more predators, species A and B would be hunted at higher rates than before. Thus, the success of species A was to the detriment of species B, not because they competed for resources, but because their increased numbers had indirect effects on the predator population. This one predator, two prey model has been explored by ecologists as early as 1925, but the term, apparent competition, was first coined by University of Florida ecologist Robert D. Holt in 1977. 13-14 Holt found that field ecologists at the time were erroneously attributing negative interactions among prey species to niche partitioning and competitive exclusion, ignoring the role of food-limited predators. 13. Apparent competition and realized niche. Apparent competition can help shape a species' realized niche, or the area or resources the species can actually persist due to interspecific interactions. The effect on realized niches could be incredibly strong, especially when there is an absence of more traditional interference or exploitative competition. A real-world example was studied in the late 1960s, when the introduction of snowshoe hares, Lepus americanus, to Newfoundland reduced the habitat range of native Arctic hares, Lepus arcticus. While some ecologists hypothesized that this was due to an overlap in the niche, other ecologists argued that the more plausible mechanism was that snowshoe hare populations led to an explosion in food-limited lynx populations, a shared predator of both prey species. Since the Arctic hare has a relatively weaker defense tactic than the snowshoe hare, they were excluded from woodland areas on the basis of differential predation. However, both apparent competition and exploitation competition might help explain the situation to some degree. 13. Support for the impact of competition on the breadth of the realized niche with respect to diet is becoming more common in a variety of systems based upon isotopic and spatial data, including both carnivores 15 and small mammals. 16. Asymmetric apparent competition. Apparent competition can be symmetric or asymmetric. 17. Symmetric apparent competition negatively impacts both species equally, from which it can be inferred that both species will persist. However, asymmetric apparent competition occurs when one species is affected less than the other. The most extreme scenario of asymmetric apparent competition is when one species is not affected at all by the increase in the predator, which can be seen as a form of amensalism, 0. 18. Human impacts on endangered prey species have been characterized by conservation scientists as an extreme form of asymmetric apparent competition, often through introducing predator species into ecosystems or resource subsidies. An example of fully asymmetric apparent competition which often occurs near urban centers is subsidies in the form of human garbage or waste. In the early 2000s, the common raven Corvus corax population in the Mojave Desert increased due to an influx of human garbage, leading to an indirect negative effect on juvenile desert tortoises, Gopherus agassizi. 19. Asymmetry in apparent competition can also arise as a consequence of resource competition. An empirical example is provided by two small fish species in postglacial lakes in western Canada, where resource competition between prickly sculpin and three-spined stickleback fish leads to a spatial niche shift mainly in three-spined stickleback. 20. As a consequence of this shift, predation by a shared trout predator increases for stickleback but decreases for sculpin in lakes where the two species co-occur compared to lakes in which each species occurs on its own together with trout predators. Because sharing predators often comes together with competition for shared food resources, apparent competition and resource competition may often interplay in nature. 21. Apparent competition in the human microbiome. Apparent competition has also been viewed in and on the human body. The human immune system can act as the generalist predator, and a high abundance of a certain bacteria may induce an immune response, damaging all pathogens in the body. Another example of this is of two populations of bacteria that can both support a predatory bacteriophage. In most situations, the one that is most resistant to infection by the shared predator will replace the other. 17. Apparent competition has also been suggested as an exploitable phenomenon for cancer treatments. Highly specialized viruses that are developed to target malignant cancer cells often go locally extinct prior to eradicating all cancer. However, if a virus were developed that targets both healthy and unhealthy host cells to some degree, the large number of healthy cells would support the predatory virus for long enough to eliminate all malignant cells. 17. Size asymmetric competition. Competition can be either complete symmetric, all individuals receive the same amount of resources, irrespective of their size, perfectly size symmetric, all individuals exploit the same amount of resource per unit biomass, or absolutely size asymmetric, the largest individuals exploit all the available resource. Among plants, size asymmetry is context dependent and competition can be both asymmetric and symmetric depending on the most limiting resource. In forest stands, below ground competition for nutrients and water is size symmetric, because a tree's root system is typically proportionate to the biomass of the entire tree. 22. Conversely, above-ground competition for light is size asymmetric. Since light has directionality, the forest canopy is dominated entirely by the largest trees. These trees disproportionately exploit most of the resource for their biomass, making the interaction size asymmetric. 23. Whether above-ground or below-ground resources are more limiting can have major effects on the structure and diversity of ecological communities. In mixed beach stands, for example, size asymmetric competition for light is a stronger predictor of growth compared with competition for soil resources. 24. Within and between species. Sea anemones compete for the territory in tide pools. Competition can occur between individuals of the same species, called intraspecific competition, or between different species, called interspecific competition. Studies show that intraspecific competition can regulate population dynamics, changes in population size over time. This occurs because individuals become crowded as the population grows. Since individuals within a population require the same resources, crowding causes resources to become more limited. Some individuals, typically small juveniles, eventually do not acquire enough resources and die or do not reproduce. This reduces population size and slows population growth. Species also interact with other species that require the same resources. Consequently, interspecific competition can alter the sizes of many species populations at the same time. Experiments demonstrate that when species compete for a limited resource, one species eventually drives the populations of other species extinct. These experiments suggest that competing species cannot coexist, they cannot live together in the same area, because the best competitor will exclude all other competing species. Interspecific. Interspecific competition occurs when members of the same species compete for the same resources in an ecosystem. 25. A simple example is a stand of equally spaced plants, which are all of the same age. The higher the density of plants, the more plants will be present per unit ground area, and the stronger the competition will be for resources such as light, water, or nutrients. Interspecific. Interspecific competition may occur when individuals of two separate species share a limiting resource in the same area. If the resource cannot support both populations, then lowered fecundity, growth, or survival may result in at least one species. Interspecific competition has the potential to alter populations, communities, and the evolution of interacting species. An example among animals could be the case of cheetahs and lions. Since both species feed on similar prey, they are negatively impacted by the presence of the other because they will have less food. However, they still persist together, despite the prediction that under competition one will displace the other. In fact, lions sometimes steal prey items killed by cheetahs. Potential competitors can also kill each other, in so-called interguild predation. For example, in Southern California, coyotes often kill and eat gray foxes and bobcats, all three carnivores sharing the same stable prey, small mammals. 26. An example among protozoa involves Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum. Russian ecologist, Georgy Gaz, studied the competition between the two species of Paramecium that occurred as a result of their coexistence. Through his studies, Gaz proposed the competitive exclusion principle, observing the competition that occurred when their different ecological niches overlapped. 27. Competition has been observed between individuals, populations, and species, but there is little evidence that competition has been the driving force in the evolution of large groups. For example, mammals lived beside reptiles for many millions of years of time but were unable to gain a competitive edge until dinosaurs were devastated by the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event. Competition has been observed between. Through his studies, Gauss proposed the competitive exclusion principle, observing the competition that occurred when their different ecological niches overlapped. 27. Competition has been observed between individuals, populations, and species, but there is little evidence that competition has been the driving force in the evolution of large groups. For example, mammals lived beside reptiles for many millions of years of time but were unable to gain a competitive edge until dinosaurs were devastated by the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event. 4. Evolutionary. For example, mammals lived beside reptiles. Competition has been observed between individuals, populations, and species, but there is little evidence that competition has been the driving force in the evolution of large groups. For example, mammals lived beside reptiles for many millions of years of time but were unable to gain a competitive edge until dinosaurs were devastated by the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event. 4. Evolutionary strategies. In evolutionary contexts, competition is related to the concept of RK selection theory, which relates to the selection of traits which promote success in particular environments. The theory originates from work on island biogeography by the ecologists Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson. 28. In RK selection theory, selective pressures are hypothesized to drive evolution in one of two stereotyped directions, RK selection. 29. These terms, R and K, are derived from standard ecological algebra, as illustrated in the simple Verhulst equation of population dynamics, 30. Where R is the growth rate of the population N, and K is the carrying capacity of its local environmental setting. Typically, R-selected species exploit empty niches, and produce many offspring, each of whom has a relatively low probability of surviving to adulthood. In contrast, K-selected species are strong competitors in crowded niches, and invest more heavily in much fewer offspring, each with a relatively high probability of surviving to adulthood. 30. Competitive exclusion principle. 1. A smaller, yellow, species of bird forages across whole tree. 2. A larger, red, species competes for resources. 3. Red dominates in middle for the more abundant resources. Yellow adapts to a new niches, avoiding competition. To explain how species coexist, in 1934 Georgy Gauss proposed the competitive exclusion principle, which is also called the Gauss principle. Species cannot coexist if they have the same ecological To explain how species coexist, in 1934 Georgy Gauss proposed the competitive exclusion principle, which is also called the Gauss principle. Species cannot coexist if they have the same ecological niche. The word niche refers to a species' requirements for survival and reproduction. These requirements include both resources, like food, and proper habitat conditions, like temperature or pH. Gauss reasoned that if two species had identical niches, required identical resources and habitats, they would attempt to live in exactly the same area and would compete for exactly the same resources. If this happened, the species that was the best competitor would always exclude its competitors from that area. Therefore, species must at least have slightly different niches in order to coexist. 31-32. Character displacement. Therefore, Gauss reasoned that if the word niche refers to a species' requirements for survival and reproduction. These requirements include both resources, like food, and proper habitat conditions, like temperature or pH. Gauss reasoned that if two species had identical niches, required identical resources and habitats, they would attempt to live in exactly the same area and would compete for exactly the same resources. If this happened, the species that was the best competitor would always exclude its competitors from that area. Therefore, species must at least have slightly different niches in order to coexist. 31-32. Character displacement. Medium brown finch Geospiza fortis on Santa Cruz Island in the Galapagos. Competition can cause species to evolve differences in traits. This occurs because the individuals of a species with traits similar to competing species always experience strong interspecific competition. These individuals have less reproduction and survival than individuals with traits that differ from their competitors. Consequently, they will not contribute many offspring to future generations. For example, Darwin's finches can be found alone or together on the Galapagos Islands. Both species populations actually have more individuals with intermediate-sized beaks when they live on islands without the other species present. However, when both species are present on the same island, competition is intense between individuals that have intermediate-sized beaks of both species because they all require intermediate-sized seeds. Consequently, individuals with small and large beaks have greater survival and reproduction on these islands than individuals with intermediate-sized beaks. Different finch species can coexist if they have traits, for instance, beak size, that allow them to specialize in particular resources. When Geospiza fortis and Geospiza fuliginosa are present on the same island, G. fuliginosa tends to evolve a small beak and G. fortis a large beak. The observation that competing species traits are more different when they live in the same area than when competing species live in different areas is called character displacement. For the two finch species, beak size was displaced, beaks became smaller in one species and larger in the other species.